Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how do we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are in relationship, individually, collectively, across time, and in and beyond the human world. Like many of your favorite podcasts, this one is brought to you by listeners like yourself via the voluntary financial contributions of people on Patreon, as well as people leaving one-time donations through PayPal or various cryptocurrencies. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube have given substantially either through Patreon or through a one-time donation. Their names are also listed in the credits to this episode. A big thank you to everyone who is supporting the show, because both literally and figuratively, you're helping me keep the lights on here. So really appreciate that. Thank you. If you are finding value in the show, please do consider contributing financially by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can head to patreon.com/support to do so, and even as little as the price of a cup of coffee once a month would be much appreciated. You could also leave one-time donations via PayPal or cryptocurrency, or buy something off the shop. Links to that are in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. So that's the beginning. We're already in it. We're in this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, which is another session of the Psychedelic Café series we're doing here. The Psychedelic Café is a kind of structured conversation that is modeled off of Vicki Robbins and Susan Partnow's Conversation Cafe style. And I actually learned this from one of the guests who are on the show today, Gene Robertson, but we'll talk about that in a second. On the Psychedelic Cafe, we feature a curated selection of guests to explore a central question. The question for this episode is, why does our sense of connection matter? And in all honesty, I hold this personally as one of the most valuable episodes I've produced, both in being a part of the conversation with these incredible people, but also in what, the artifact that was created in the process, the one that you are about to listen, the one that you're really actually listening to right now. So, I hope that by the end of the episode, you feel the same way. Given the question, why does our sense of connection matter? Got it. The conversation explores primarily how whether or not we feel connected affects everything. We also explore the neurobiological origins of our sense of connection or disconnection with each other, and how that's wrapped up in individual and collective traumas. We explore our sense of connection with nature and the consequence that our lack of it is having on our lives and all life on the planet. We also explore strategies and pathways of increasing our sense of connection with ourselves, with each other, and with the natural world. Additionally, we also talk about connecting with spiritual energies and our dead loved ones, ancestry in general, the importance of being able to grieve together, and the value of learning to turn towards pain. Now, our guests for this episode are going to introduce themselves in the context for why they're in this conversation right at the beginning of the cafe. So I'll leave that for now. But first, I'm just going to list off their names, many of which you might recognize if you've been a listener of the show. Those names are Sam Gandy, Darshan Narvaez, Gene Robertson, Robert Gilman, Sky Otter, also known as Bill Pfeiffer, Rita Bosey, who you might know as the Tooth Fairy, and Charlie Winninger. Now, the reason why you might recognize these names is that other than Robert Gilman, all of these guests have been on the show previously for individual episodes, some of which more than once. And when I mentioned you may know Rita as the Tooth Fairy, she was previously on some anonymous underground psychedelic therapists podcast that I did a couple of them, and has since sort of revealed who she is beneath the pseudonym. If by the end of the episode you find any one of these people particularly interesting, in the show notes to this at jameswjesso.com will be links to their respective domains of work, as well as links to their episodes here on Adventures Through the Mind. So With all that said, the ado is done, and here is this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, another Psychedelic Café exploring the question of why does our sense of connection matter? Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Psychedelic Café. I'm really happy that all of you were able to make it because there's a number of factors in any given moment that could prevent us from showing up for something that we planned, from the most minuscule to the most tragic and dramatic, and all of us are here, and that's a real pleasure. To start off the conversation, we'll go through and have each person just introduce yourselves. This is my name, this is what I do, and then we will get officially into the Psychedelic Café. So based on how I'm seeing people on my screen, I will list the order in which you will introduce yourselves, and I'll just get you to remember who you're talking after. Does that make sense? So we'll start with Charlie, Jean, Rita, Robert, Sam, Darsha, and Bill. And take it away, Charlie.
Hi, I'm Charlie Wininger, licensed psychotherapist in private practice here in New York for the past over 30 years, and an author of a book called Listening to Ecstasy, The Transformative Power of MDMA. And I like to, I'm drawn to the topic because I like to call MDMA the chemical of connection.
I'm Jean Robertson. My favorite description was one given to me by someone who said, "Oh, you're a freelance person." And that's the basic definition. I consider myself a holder of a learning community space that's about 50 years long. And its present embodiment is actually a community that has its geographic base where James Jesso's home is. So he is a part of my learning community as it's showing up at this point. And essentially, that learning community has been holding a space for the emergence of what I've called Humanity 3, and what Robert Gilman, who's going to introduce himself, has called the planetary era. And that formation of what it is I'm doing goes back to the 80s when I first became aware of Robert's work.
I'm Rita Bozy. I reside in Calgary, but currently I'm in the Arctic Circle in northern Norway. I am a somatic relational trauma and psychedelic informed facilitator, an educator, a podcast host, and soon to be author of a novel called When I Was Better.
So I'm Robert Gilman, and clearly a friend of Jean's. A little over 40 years ago, I founded something called Context Institute, and that continues. And at the moment, I'm primarily focused on what we call the Bright Future program, which is all about accelerating the emergence of that planetary era that Jean was talking about. And that definitely core to that is all of us discovering and living into our connections in a much more full way.
Sam, you're up.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Gandhi. My background is in ecology. I'm also currently a researcher, slightly independent researcher, and science writer. I am also an occasional collaborator with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College, and my primary research focus or interest is the capacity of psychedelics to influence human connection to nature, or our relationship to nature.
Hello, I'm Darsha Narvaez. I'm Professor Emerita at the University of Notre Dame of Psychology. And I think I'm here because I am about connection. I talk about and write about the early relational experience in particular, and how it forms the brain and multiple capacities that kind of stick with us for life. I have a new book just came out called Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Happy to be here.
Hi, Sky Otter here, formerly Bill Pfeiffer. It's good to see older brothers, Charlie and Robert Gilman, and a new brother, James Jesso, and the rest of you beautiful people that I'm sure will be fast friends when this is over. Hopefully, my internet connection will remain. My heart connection will always be there. I'd say my newest incarnation, which is probably 100,000 years old, is my shamanic ceremonial work, which includes psychedelics. Sam Gandy nailed it as far as kind of using, not using, but being with nature so that we, what did you call it? Humanity 3.0, that we're just, that we evolve in a good way. And that's why I'm here, to connect deeper and to evolve in a good way.
Okay, so we're going to jump straight in to the Psychedelic Café, which is a structured conversation that revolves around a single question. For the first round, we're going to each share one clear, coherent thought on the question in the same order we did previously, which was Charlie, Jean, Rita, Robert, Sam, Darsha, Bill. If you're not ready to share your thought, just say pass, and I will come back to you at the end. And the question that we are holding today in this conversation is, why does our sense of connection matter?
Okay, well, also in your instructions, James, you said speak from personal experience, so I'll do that. It matters to me because my sense of connection matters to me because it shakes me out of my trance of separation, that I am somehow better or worse than others, and I'm separate from them. And when I am in that space, which I am often because I spend a lot of time in my head, too much time, and when I'm there, I sometimes forget my connection to others. So when I'm in that space, I believe that my problems are important and significant. And when I'm connected to others, it sort of, that sense evaporates. And I find that to be quite helpful and a helpful relief.
I notice that the question isn't just about why is connection important, but why is the sense of connection important, which takes me into thinking about it from the subjective point of view. The subjective, which is characterized by a lot of what I've experienced from the commons of human thinking over my life, comes from the objective position, like telling me what connection is, telling me, and I want that information. But I come to realize that for me, the most alive part is the subjectivity and understanding my subjectivity and what that is for you. It's like I want to know what your sense of connection is as much as I want to know why my sense of connection is important, because I've come to believe that the world is actually a web of conversation of us speaking together through our artifacts, through the way that we construct our lives. And we're not very good at participating in that conversation consciously. And I'm enjoying that we're here in a form that's asking us to do that.
So when I thought about this question, and I thought about it for quite some time, why our sense of connection matters, and I thought about it as an energetic sensory compass, knowing of self, knowing of the other, and how a sense of connection can steer our lost boats in the direction of port. So I think of it as a compass of destiny. And I have a very short story to share about this. A number of years I was living in Vancouver, and a writer from the UK had just moved to Vancouver, and she felt quite disoriented. We sat down on a beach, and she didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she wanted to live in Vancouver. And I really wanted to help her out. And I thought for a moment, who do I need to connect her with? And she had to either return to the UK quickly or get a job. And I thought for a moment, from my heart, I had this sense that I wanted to connect her with a choreographer. And I told her, you should look up this choreographer. I don't know why. 20 years later, I returned to Vancouver, and I saw this woman I barely recognized, and she held up a baby. And then I said, I looked at her and I recognized her. And she said, this is my life. Because of something you said to me, it changed my entire life. I was flabbergasted. And she said, you sat down with me. You cared enough to sit down with me on a beach and connect me with someone. And that changed the course of my entire life. And I was my heart felt so full that in those right moments when we can attune, we can connect people and steer destiny and be a part of that. So I always, when I can, I always stop for a minute to help people connect each other. And who knows what can happen. And that's how I ended up in the Arctic Circle.
Great. So I want to just say that my sense is that we really do live in this ocean of relationships. And so much of what holds us back is our inability to sense those relationships. So I want to flip that around from a problem statement to an opportunity statement. That we have this huge human opportunity that comes from being able to not only really sense our connection with things like nature and a sense of connection with people that we're in immediate relationship with, but also our sense of connection into our shared psychic dimensions. And who knows what beyond that? The Earth has got, another billion years or so in which it will be habitable. And humans have only been around, for, depending upon how you count it, like 100,000, 200,000 years. We have a lot more to go. And I suspect that discovering that lot more is in many ways going to grow out of deepening our capacity to sense our connections.
I think I would answer this question sort of coming from the big picture, sum total of humanity view, if I may answer on behalf of sort of all of us, and say that our sense of connection or connectedness is very, very important not just for our general health and well-being, but it's part of what allows us to truly thrive and flourish as humans. Social connectedness has been shown to be one of the most powerful natural buffers against depression. Nature-connectedness, as well as strong links to well-being, is also a powerful predictor of pro-nature attitudes and behaviors. So, unfortunately, despite how important connectedness is in a broad sense, connectedness to ourselves, connectedness to others, connectedness to nature and to the universe or perceived spiritual transpersonal principle, it's increasingly scarce as a result of the particular path that our materialistic, individualistic, consumerist, techno-oriented civilization has taken. And we need to, if we want a long-term, viable and pleasant future on this planet, we need to reclaim that which we have lost and are losing.
Well, in my view, everything about us is affected by whether we feel connected or disconnected. And so, unfortunately, as Sam was alluding to, our culture has shifted to disconnecting us, almost intentionally, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes unintentionally. So in the last few hundred years, especially, and now spread all over the world through colonization, we've been told that our body is separate from our mind from spirit, humans from nature, and then white males kind of better than everyone else, right? There's disconnection every way you can think about. And that's not our ancestral way of being. That's not what our species adapted to. We adapted as part of the members of the biocommunity. So the indigenous worldview, what I also call a kinship worldview, is all about feeling connected and making sure you're staying in the connected mode, right? So when I meet the spider in the disconnected mode, I might go, oh, you dirty, icky thing, get out of here, smash, right? The connected view is, oh, hello, relative. Hi, nice to see you. Please hang around. Teach me something, right? Or let me honor you and thank you for your livingness and all you do for us. So that it's just so different. If I feel connected, I'm going to honor and respect all of living Earth. And most people, until the last few hundred years, believed and sensed the sentience of the Earth. And I think we've now, I think in part because we lost the sense of connection, we're destroying what we think is inert.
Well, for my money, James, this is the question. And as I'm listening, I've watched myself go from, who are some of these people that I haven't seen in this lifetime, and not too much the others, to maybe a slight sense of not really disconnection, but a little bit of, let's say, neutrality in my level of connection. And then as I listen, and Rita, your story really, really moved me. And I felt that, that feeling that we all have where there's just this, like, our heart gets touched in a certain way. And for whatever reason, because this is part of the mystery of life, that little, like, choked up or that little bit of tear might come. And I felt that. And, how sweet it is to make a difference in one person's life, let alone many. So I'm just delighted to be in on this conversation. I feel very fortunate that the internet gods are allowing me to, take part. So yeah, it's very beautiful. And Darsha, that last thing is, pretty much word for word what I'm saying all the time, that everybody and everything is our brothers and sisters, is our family. It's all family. It's a family of relationships, and in a sense, the the beauty of psychedelics is we can accelerate that sense if we do it right.
So, bringing myself into the conversation now, I think when I think about the question, why does our sense of connection matter? I see sort of an arc, which might be an aging and temperament related to aging and maturation process. It could be cultural, it could be personal learning, what have you. But I see this sort of arc in me of, like, a kind of, for as far back as I can remember, a kind of connection at some point, perhaps, and then a kind of like needing to be myself. And then increasingly, even as I started to value my own sort of like, I need to be a better person. I want to do the healing, do the learning. Still, it was very much about me, and increasingly moving into relationship, and then moving into like relationship over time. And like that the arc of my experience increasingly seems to like zone in on how, and I think it was mentioned at some point, the very foundation of what allows me to be the most vibrant expression of myself is to be in connection, both with others, with my own like waves, my own various aspects of myself, my emotions, my mind, so on and so forth, with nature, and just with the sense that I like to call it connection with a capital C is, and I am that too. And that foundation feels just absolutely essential for me to fully be, I guess, like my most beautiful expression of myself, even in my dark times. So that's one of the reasons why each of you got invited here, is because each of you at some point sparked a greater understanding for myself of not only what the value of that is, but how to live with the learning process of coming into it. So that's the end of the first round. We're going to get into the second round now. And this is a free-flowing conversation. Anyone can speak at any time. Speak into the center. Silence is welcome. And here we go.
Well, I like what was said earlier. I'm forgetting who said it now, but was it Darsha? I'm not sure. Somebody said that whether we feel connected or not affects everything. So yeah, thank you, Darsha. And that is certainly my sense. Not only it affects everything for me personally, but when I look at the world, I see. I mean, I live in the U.S. and I draw a straight line between the politics that have been arising here in this country in the past 10 or 15 years, from the degree of nationalism and all that gave rise to Trump, and I think might give rise to somebody else in the future, is directly caused or influenced by the atomization of the culture, where everyone feels distant from everyone else. And you have primary means of communication called social media, where people they don't really feel connected, so it's easy to attack, and that's what you see on Twitter or Facebook, and it's easy to attack and demonize others, and that comes, in my opinion, from the lack of a sense of connection, or a lack of a sense of like, I'm just a fumbling human being just like you are, and trying to find my way just like you are, and let's help each other do that. It's impacting everything in this culture, and it's such an important question about our sense of connection, not just our connection, but our sense of connection, and how it matters for for getting our species moving in the right direction.
I agree with you, Charlie. And I think the roots of it go into our early experience in childhood. That's what we study in my lab, where we actually emphasize disconnection. We encourage parents to detach from their children, and they're forced into it because we have no parental paid leave after a baby's born. But even the doctors at birth, it's all about, it's not honoring the dignity of that individual baby as a connected baby and keep them connected. Other cultures and our traditions ancestrally were to keep connecting and keep the baby calm. But we routinely stress them, and then that sense of connection to life is broken, and over and over and over, and trauma, and we send them to school, and disconnected in so many ways. So our work is trying to emphasize, how do we get back? What's wrong? What went wrong? And we have a little movie, 6-minute movie, Breaking the Cycle film.org is a place to get it. And I think people don't know what the source is, right? But they carry forward the sense of depression and fear and insecurity, and they're easily angered, shifted into all these are survival modes of the brain that get enhanced from all this stress in early life. Call it early toxic stress now. And they don't know why. They're used to externalizing. It's all out there. It's them. You made me feel mad, instead of it's me being dysregulated and I can't, find my balance. And so that it's easy to shift or groom people into being authoritarian because they're already kind of, off balance. And we've got that going on in the United States.
I'll jump in and say yes. With what we do in the Bright Future Now program, that is an important part of what I'm focused on at this point. Part of it is this focus on the trauma in the first 5 years and the degree to which we live in a traumatizing culture. I would actually say that it's not just the last few hundred years, it's actually more like the last 5,000 years that has been traumatizing. But that aside, I think for me, the path out is not only understanding those traumas, but learning how to kind of release the constraints from them, how to ease up from them. Because for me, our birthright is to be able to live in a safe psychological space. The vagus nerve in a happy state, if you will. And when we're there, we're in a place that I like to describe as the optimal zone, that is not only more pleasant, but is also where you're just more functional. It's the flow state is up in there. But if you're in your defensive zone, if you've had your fight, flight, your amygdala triggered and all that sort of thing, then it breaks connection. And breaking connection, increases that sense of defensiveness. And we've got stuck in places where there are these ongoing feedback loops in the culture that just accentuate that. I look at things like social media, and for me, I see that more as a symptom. I don't want to be too categorical about this because there's lots of design aspects about social media that need to be improved, but it's really being able to get to that place of learning how to increase each other's safety and our own safety, learning how to self-regulate, learning how to help others regulate, so that we can collectively lift ourselves out of this morass of traumatization, mutual traumatization, feeling like it's all, like I'm the only one who's feeling this and not realizing that it's a cultural phenomenon.
Can I just say the flow?
Yeah, please.
The flow thing can go, the survival systems can also go into flow. So they pointed this out in the Rwanda massacres. People just got into a flow of killing because there's a sense of competence that you get video game killing too. It's like, oh, wow, well, look how good I am, whatever it is. And I think that happens at the Trump rallies. People have this, we're so great, and we're going to get those people over there, right? And it kind of flow also. So it matters which kind of flow, right? Where you put your attention, mindset you're in, right? That's all.
Yeah. Granted.
Robert, did you finish your thought?
I think well enough for now.
Well, I'd like to jump in on that. The trauma has been going on particularly strongly for 5,000 years. And so I'd like to suggest that we have the return path. We have the way of remembering what it was like being fully embodied, let's say pre-5,000 years, fully embodied in the earth, in the stars, with the spirit, and that the original teachings of indigenous people, I think they understood that our ability to have abstract thinking was a kind of like, what is that myth, where you get a taste of this fire. Maybe it's the Promethean fire, where you get this two-edged sword, where you have this super skill of abstract thinking, but it comes with a great price. And so just yesterday, I wish I could show you because I'm looking at it. We had some really beautiful Ojibwe elders here who ran a really, really kick-ass sweat lodge, and we just got down to it, and we felt, the bones of the earth, the grandfather stones coming in, and a real teaching about, one last thing, which is somewhat of a non sequitur, but I've been looking at Charlie this whole time, and when I said grandfather stones, it was like he was part of a group of men who changed my life and helped me walk on the wild side and do me, and not what everybody was telling me what I should do. So there's some connection to be discovered there. But I just wanted to throw that into the pot, that we have it's all here for us to return to a brighter future by looking at our origins as our destiny. Was that understandable?
That was great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I often wonder, as a child of refugees, the profound impact of disconnection. And much of my life, I've felt more disconnection than connection, having been pulled apart from my ancestors and grandparents and tribe and the culture that my parents came from. And I often wonder about the fact that sometimes it takes tragedies for us to get connected again. And it's sad to think that it takes tragedies for us to be connected, and that's when so many people come together. And so I often wonder in myself if I can better build a capacity to meet pain, if I can actually get more connected, because it's the pain that has often disconnected me, and not knowing my roots, or my roots being so far away. So, as we talk about connection, I often wonder about what is a sincere connection, because I came from a place of desperate need for connection, which often created false connection. So for me, it's a real subtle sense of like, what is a false connection? What is a sincere connection? And how do people ripped from their homes, as is happening in the Ukraine right now, there's this deep sense of connection through trauma that everyone is going through, the Eastern Europeans, and then after the aftermath of that, how do those connections live on? What are real connections? That I've been often asking myself that question: what is real? What is sincere? What is from the heart? And I do find that it takes a lot of reflection and contemplation to get down to that place of it being a heart connection rather than a connection that comes out of desperation. So I always like to slow down enough to feel that and to take that time to build connection over time. Because some people have had to go so far away, their souls have had to go so far away out of relationship. And how do we invite people back into connection is always what I'm curious about, how to do it in a slow, gentle, sincere, and thoughtful way.
Well, I found a way. I don't know how scalable this way is, but among the things that my wife and I do is that we run circles of people a couple of times a year. We host group gatherings where everyone goes to, if it's warm weather, like we're going to do it in later this month in the park. And if it's cold weather in the winter, we do it at somebody's big apartment, where we're gathering for the day and doing MDMA together and having a certain structure like confidentiality and speaking from personal experience and that sort of thing. But these are extraordinary experiences. It's the height of my year. And the sense of connection that we feel with each other. And so many of these people that I put together, because I select them very carefully, trying to have diversity and but I'm very careful about who I choose. The sense of connection is so deep, and many of these people never met before. Ongoing relationships come from this. Friendships start from this that lasts for years. People want to stay connected afterwards in a group on Signal, an encrypted app where you can talk freely. And these Signal groups go on for years because people just feel this profound sense of connection. And it tells me about, these medicines in general, and in my mind, maybe I'm biased, MDMA in particular, can help people heal the traumas that we're talking about in community, and feel connected in a profound and lasting way. And like I say, I don't know how scalable this is, but I do envision a time when instead of 50 people in the park, like we're going to have later this month, 500 people in the park, and eventually 5,000. Because I think that the potential is there, and it has to be done right and with all kinds of parameters in place. But the healing that can come from this is extraordinary that I've seen. And so I'm a big believer in the potential of these medicines.
I want to jump in with what feels like a not entirely coherent thought yet. So we'll see, which is something like what Charlie was speaking to about creating this real profound sense of interpersonal connection with others through chemical agents, right? It could be through also other sort of altered states, as Sky was speaking to the sweat lodge and so on and so forth. And then also wondering, then there's the navigation of safety and danger. There's like a lot of complexity in my thought here of all the different variables that are at play. And in that, there's a wondering of like, and what kind of interpersonal patterns and skills do we have in communication and conversation and how many of them are a relic of not so great functioning relationships? How much of it is a relic of a society, of a culture, of a kind of early life encouragement that leaves us, at the very least, less optimized in maintaining connection and repairing bonds? And if that's the case, what skills, what upskilling, and in what ways would serve our ability to not only say we get the chemical connection or the ritual connection, whatever it is, but that it's sustainable in the navigation of the huge range of complexity of what it is to relate to somebody, regardless of how much you like them or love them. It gets complex and sticky and weird, and it's like, what's the skills? What are those skills? How do we practice them? And how do we implement them in a way that sort of like lays a good foundation for those who follow us? Then that's not explicitly asking each of you what those skills are. It's a general question about like, yeah, this is a wondering, what does it take?
Well, and part of that in my wondering is skills is one thing. What else might it take? And the focus on skills is part of we're going to solve this problem. We're going to get the tools in hand and let's just do it. But what is the context, and what part does the context play in the patterns that you're seeing? And I have so much empathy for what you're saying. The history of one's own relationships is primary research material.
Well, I talk about in what I've written, my neurobiology book, in Human Morality. I talk about how we don't even know what human thriving looks like anymore. And we're starting to write about that. And you can see this in the societies that provide the evolved nest, what we call the evolved nest to their young, their brains, and then they provide the nest throughout life. So the nest is soothing perinatal experiences. So gestation, birth, after birth, all connectedness, and then breastfeeding for several years. And it should be 2.5 to 6 years because our brain needs it, our immune system needs it. It's a shocker, I know. The positive moving touch, pretty constant in the first years of life. No negative touch that misdirects the trajectory of the child. We have long-term evidence now. Spanking kids is like physical abuse. Then there's self-directed free play with others, multiple age others. So lots of play through childhood, not sports, organized sports, right? It's, running around, climbing trees and everything. And then responsive relationships. And so responsiveness for a baby is keeping the baby calm so the biochemistry is right for growing everything. And then multiple adult caregivers, because babies need so much. We all need mentors throughout life. Nature immersion and connection, and then routine healing practices. And I forgot, welcoming social climates. You're always, in a positive climate of expansiveness and joy and serenity, and rather than dread and fear and anger. And then routine healing practices, which keep you back into balance, get you back into balance. And I talk about how these practices actually lead to what I call receptive intelligence. So that's the ability to perceive the natural world's communications, to feel comfortable in the natural world, your local landscape, and to know how to get along. You learn that when you're nested in that place, to get along with the animals and plants without destroying them, right, or fearing them in some extreme way, being smart about it. And we really have lost that. And I think to get it back, we have to go back and re-nest ourselves. Lots of nature immersion and connection. John Young has all sorts of practices, a sit spot. We've used when I was teaching undergraduates, we do things like that. I use folk song games. I was a music teacher at one time, and that grows the right hemisphere. What we've done with our babies and our children, we've undergrown the right hemisphere. And that's the seat of empathy, higher consciousness, self-control, and connection. And there's certain sensitive periods for that. It grows more rapidly in the first years of life. So therapists find that men coming into therapy, after with an empty nest, kids have gone to college, the couple comes in, the woman is ready to go see the world, and the guy just wants to stay in his man cave. And so Dan Siegel says this is right hemisphere underdevelopment. And the way you get back that growth, because you can grow it throughout life, is you play and you do things that keep you in the present moment, where you have to respond and be creative, art, dancing, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of things to restore, and the indigenous perspective. And so they have place-based knowledge, which we cannot. You have to grow up in it with elders and know the language and all that. But we can take up the indigenous worldview, which is what we call a kinship worldview, which is the sense of wholeness and egalitarianism and respect for any gender and all sorts of. We have 40 precepts. So anyway, 4 arrows is the guy who came up with 40.
Yeah, one thing I would just like to say, following on from that, very interesting perspective from Darcia. Like, one thing that actually works in our favor, because it's kind of easy to, it looks quite bleak, the scale of the problem of the disconnection of humans from the planet, from each other, from themselves. It's broadly speaking probably getting worse, and it has a lot of bad stuff stems from it. So it can seem a bit sort of bleak, but something that sort of emerged from the research is that connectedness as a construct, broadly speaking, in terms of self, others, nature, a spiritual principle / the universe, is that itself, connectedness itself is interconnected. And so what that means is there's some interesting studies that have been done showing that simple engagement with nature, so training people to be curious. Curiosity is one of the best and most interesting and trainable of human qualities, and curiosity is a pathway to deepened engagement with appreciation for nature. And this short-term intervention, where people were encouraged to sort of take an interest in nature, like emotionally, if they emotionally engaged in something, they would take a photo of it and they would record a sentence of how it made them feel over, I think, about a 2-week period, not particularly long term. But one of the interesting findings of this study was that it did not just increase connectedness to nature itself, which was obviously the target of the intervention, but it increased connectedness broadly to themselves, to the person undergoing the intervention, and also to other people as well. And we see echoes of this elsewhere as well. So research looking into the experience of awe, and awe is just the other side of the coin from deep interconnectedness, but also, feeling small in relation to something much greater in reference to that interconnectedness. And one of the things that tends to follow in the wake of awe is pro-social feelings towards other humans, to your tribe or community. And it also seems to be a part of nature-connectedness. But if we also look at pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors, and I would kind of argue that these are like the emergent behavioral symptoms, if you will, of nature and social connectedness. These also have a reciprocal relationship. So if you become more pro-environmental, you tend to become more pro-social as well. And so broadly, these different findings, I think they're quite positive and exciting, because it shows these different forms of connectedness are not isolated islands out there. They're all interlinked. And sort of, if you work on increasing or enhancing one of them, you may well have these spillover effects in other areas. And, that works because humans are individuals. Some of them might prefer to connect with other people or themselves or with nature. But it seems like you're going to get synergistic benefits in other areas as well.
Put in what may be an outrageous note, but sort of an optimistic note, that says that actually, I think at a general level, the sense of connectedness is actually growing at this point. And we see the world in part through the media. And it's important to keep remembering that the media's business model is to grab your amygdala and grab your attention in that way. But I think that if you look at your own personal experiences, if you look at the people that you are in touch with and the degree to which they are both unhappy with the disconnect, and so, I mean, searching for, they have a longing for something. And that's a first step towards getting there. And for me, there's a stronger sense of longing that I see around, which I want to see as a kind of positive trend. I also want to step to what Jean was saying about context. And I think that, I can't resist. One of the important questions is the universe friendly? And in that kinship mode, the universe is friendly. The universe is, you are in relationship with all kinds of different levels of the universe. So that feels to me like a really important piece in here. And then one more thing I want to throw in, and just I'm going to jump really to specific skills, because I think that the skill of self-regulation is just so key for adults. It's obviously really key for children to develop that, but you don't have to say, well, I never got it, so forget it. We have the opportunity now to build up those skills. And the more I learn about the upper parasympathetic nervous system, vagus nerve, et cetera, the more it seems to me that there are 100 different ways that different traditions have developed to do this. And it's actually very simple if you get right down to it. It's about, so I want to share a specific technique at this point. To just illustrate that one of the things that we use is something I call the neurological reset, that starts by wiggling your face as a way of stimulating all the, through that stimulating the upper parasympathetic nervous system. And then you breathe in through your nose easily, comfortably, and then you breathe out through your mouth more slowly than you breathe in through your nose. And those of you who know this stuff know that slower out breath is connected with the heart synchronization. And do that 3 times. And then the thing that I add to that is to do a heart hug. So if I just stand there, with a heart hug, just, you can do a full, whatever it is that feels good, get that sense of connection and do even 3 of those breaths. It's remarkable how much it shifts the physiology, it shifts the neural tone. And if you have a group of people who can say, let's take a pause and just do a reset, then you can shift the energy in terms of what's happening, in a couple relationship, in a group meeting, and in other things of this sort. So I think part of the awareness of connection is this awareness of what's, where are we in terms of our neurological activation, and where is the group in terms of its neurological activation, and the ability to keep helping it come back to a place where curiosity, kindness, compassion, all of these things are simply more accessible. They're our birthright. Enough.
That makes me
or humming together also promotes that vagus nerve functioning.
Right.
So just, singing to yourself or humming or, being in a choir together, or, the routine in our ancestral context is to dance and to sing and drum and move, so, right. And you're doing it every day almost, or multiple times a day, depending. We need to, remember that we need to rebalance all day long, perhaps, or every day or every week, something.
Yeah.
All right, Rita.
No problem at all. One of the things I love to do with groups and dyads is a conversation without words, just through the eyes, just through sound, and that very slow listening, because I find that it takes such quietness to hear the many levels of a soul, to hear the many levels of a person, just that subtle knowing. And when we're going too quickly, we miss such subtle cues of how someone is expressing in that moment. So for me, connection, I have this image of my mother. My poor mother went through a lot of trauma for political reasons. And there were times where she would just kind of like put her head down and put her hand on her forehead. And I knew those moments to be moments where she was trying to find connection with herself. She was fully exasperated, but I could always see that there was this innate part of her in all her trauma where her hand would reach her forebrain, and she would quietly sit for a moment, and she would find a kind of reset in herself. And I remember appreciating her so much in those moments, even though I hated her in those moments. But I'm so fascinated by how the body actually knows and wants to reconnect. And if we watch closely and observe very quietly, people are always trying to reconnect. And we're always trying to connect in subtle ways, even if we're turning away. So I think that disconnection is a way back to connection, and it's always changing. And so I think that I do want to say to people, for those for whom it's difficult to come to maybe join a choir, because I wish I could, or to get group involvement, what are those small ways, those tiny ways that we can start, even by, feeling a little bit of connection through our own skin? And there's so many ways to do it. And I'm interested in sometimes those small ways to just begin to bring life back again,
I think it's fabulous that we have hundreds of different ways to do it, but I also feel it's really important for people to have a group of probably less than 5 things that they can do that they will remember and actually do. Otherwise, it just becomes a list that in the moment, when you really need it and you aren't thinking well. So what are those few simple ways? Sorry.
Related to what you were saying, Robert, is where I thought you were going to go was saying having a group of 5 people that could agree on what to do when they need self-regulation.
That too. Yes, right.
That's where I thought you were going to go as well, is like have those small groups of connections. Because I do think that with social media, there's this incredible pressure to be connected to everyone. And again, that takes me back to sincere connection. I find it so interesting, those fleeting connections. I used to work in theater, and we would get together and we'd do these shows together, and it'd be very, very intimate. And we'd work together for 3 months, and we built these really strong connections over the course of performing. And then everyone went their different ways, and it felt so jarring. And you kind of feel like you're buddies for life, but then you have to go work elsewhere. So my question is, how do we navigate, profound intimacy, and then the separation of that, and then what do we do in the meantime? Because I don't know about you, but I can't feel connected all the time. And I'd like to, of course, it's connected to the earth, connected to nature. But human connection, when we have histories of moving and not being with families, that kind of permeates all the time, that sense. Or, I really love I love the suggestions of the indigenous way of thinking. And I've been coming back to understand what is that? What is that for me as a Hungarian Canadian? The indigenous way. I find my way through poetry, through the poetry of Joy Harjo, that for me is connection every single day of my life. I can read her poems 100 times over. And of course, there's that sense of, oh, somehow I'm connected to her, or I'm connected to Patti Smith because I love the way she thinks, or, it's so interesting then, people that have a voice that connects to everybody. And then all of a sudden it raises something in you. I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but now as I have a podcast and people write to me, I make a point of answering people, because in that moment they feel a connection. And even if I don't have a lot of time, just to acknowledge someone and say, hey, I'm so glad that something I said touched you. I think that's so important, even if we can find a moment to do that, because in a moment it's like, oh, I had a connection, kind of touched in a lot of different places there.
Something, go ahead, Bill.
So when you asked the question, the first thought that came to my mind was listening, and how well how many of us are there? 7? How well we're doing it, and how in Western culture, we are really taught to compete and talk over each other. That is actually a skill that we learned, a terrible skill. And so there's unlearning to be had by actually pausing. And Robert, you used that word, pause, so I would like to suggest that a real keeper of this whole psychedelic cafe is that we go out into the world self-regulating and pausing, and so like these psychedelic experiences are these expanded states of realization, of connection on a very broad scale. But here we are most of the time, having just conversations with our friends, lovers, even social media. And, before you get into that political argument, self-regulate and pause and see if what you were reacting to actually needs to be said at all. And I think, this is, what is it? We're in the process right here and now of collective intelligence. Like, all right, what are we bringing out into the world? So just going to repeat it again, because it's a real keeper for me, which is self-regulate and pause and listen. Really listen with my heart. What is this person saying to me? They're just as valuable as me. The Creator put this person on this planet right here and right now. I'm no better than them, no worse than they are. What is it that they have to say? So anyway, you all know this, but we all sorely need to learn this. Really, we need to practice this.
Kind of stepping back to something Rita was saying, I had this thing that came to mind, and also I had invited everybody. What's not being talked about? Think about that. And one of the things that I realize is not being talked about, or at least not explicitly, as we're talking about connection to each other, to the land, and to, in some sense, also like, of course, we're building culture, we're building new ways so that our future could be, better as well. So we're connected to our future as well, is wondering about the connections we have to people who are no longer here. Like the connection to our dead people and the people we claim of our dead to be our ancestors. Because I make that switch. There's like the people who are our dead people, and then our ancestors are our dead people whom we claim to like live in our lives in some way. And like wondering about that too, how much of our sense of, I know for myself, I know the names of the people who I'm like close with. I have relationship with some of the people who I've been close with who have died. But when I think about my sort of family line, I know the name of my paternal grandfather who is dead, whom I never met, and my uncle who is dead, who I never met. And other than that, I don't really have a lot of names. So like, who are these people that I come from? And so there's this, I'm just introducing, do with as you choose, like interjecting this question about our connection to those who have gone before us, and what the value is of that to have in our lives as we're talking about being connected.
Well, I have an altar in my room with pictures of my ancestors, the ones I have, and other spirit guides, really, who have just come to me. And so I, every day, will connect, I guess, with them and ask for any help that I'll need that day, or guidance, suggestions, that kind of thing. So I go along with David Bohm's idea that we are in an implicate order. We're little blobs that poked up out of this huge order, right? And most of creativity comes from outside. The idea is coming into us, not in our little minds. He kind of denigrated that little thought loop we get into, that our culture gets into, that we're thinking everything, that we are, we are so powerful. It's actually, we're in this huge entangled web of life, right? That's constantly impacting us. And that's, the muse. You have to follow your muse when you're writing, or else you can lose. She'll stop talking to you, right? So you got to pay attention, write everything down when it comes. And so I just have that sense of being this big, huge, dynamic soup of connection. Now, there are days when I, for some reason, get a sense of disconnection, and then I'm depressed, how are we going to save the world, blah, 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 blah. That's because I got out of the soup somehow, the awareness, right, of that beautiful interscape, outerscape, soundscape, whatever, of being. And once you're back there, it's like, everything's fine.
I got to share with you, I'm reading thank you, Dasha. I'm reading a book, this book, Lost Connections. And it's a terrific book. And it's basically, the idea is that is the source of depression and anxiety in the individual human, and that how we lost connections with family, with each other, with meaningful work, all the things that have been lost in the kind of culture and society that we have. That's what causes depression. And I'm just finding it a very, very helpful book.
James, you raised the question of connection to our biological ancestors.
I think there was that, but that was a part of me trying to figure out what was on my mind, and it was more rooted in our sense of being in living relationship and in connection with the people who are dead, are dead people, essentially, mm-hmm. and that recognizing that as a part of connection as well. I'm not sure how much more flushed out I can make that idea right now, but that was sort of what I was pointing at. I guess in some sense to the unseen worlds, but we could set that aside. But that was what I was kind of pointing at.
Yeah. Well, maybe this is a bit of a connection to those unseen worlds, but I also think of what I like to describe as my incarnational ancestors. So I have my biological ancestors, and I also have my incarnational ancestors. And how do I relate to both of those in many ways? And I just say my experience, I have a very powerful feeling gives me a tingle just to really to connect with it, of these layers and layers of ancestors standing behind me, cheering me on, saying, go. We would so have loved to have had the opportunity to help humanity move forward the way you do now. And we did our part. We did the relay race. We did our part in that relay race. And we are now cheering you on to do your part in the relay race. And so it's this incredible stretching back and back feeling of support from, anyway, words don't really quite capture the feeling of it, but I just wanted to share that sense of connection.
I'm stirring up in me thoughts about that are related to the fact that in the learning community, as I now experience, including the people I live with and the people who might show up in our backyard cafe when it opens next week. There are people in every decade of my life that turn up. I'm going into my 80s. There are children. There, birthday celebration I had, we counted. There was every decade represented, and a balance of men and women. But one of the skills that we're having to really work at is becoming multi-perspectival. And I think that ancestors are another perspective on our life, and that the fundamental capacity that we're working on is to get outside our own perspectives and see the world from multiple perspectives. And that ancestors wear an absolutely important cultural perspective. That was how the culture was carried on. But now we also have generational perspectives. People who are now in their 30s are in such a different world than I was at their age. And it's like we're doing work to deliberately open up their awareness of my experience as I'm getting awareness of their experience, and bringing all this knowledge together, including the kind of information like how old do we consider the universe to be? To become aware of how recently that was common knowledge, how recently there's world literacy, as you've pointed out, Robert, and yet that gets taken for granted as some kind of normal, unless you can keep opening up the perspectives as lived experience. So we're kind of trying out a practice of considering an ancestor, anyone who was born before you, and cultivating active ancestring as a skill.
Mm-hmm.
I find it absolutely necessary to learn our family's stories, our ancestors' stories. There's so much that we learn. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was an interview with Margaret Atwood on a Canadian CBC show called Q. And Margaret Atwood said, we were so used to quarantining. This was always happening when I was young. We were always quarantining. We were always getting up and going out into the countryside. This is normal for me. I mean, she says, I'm a writer. I spend a lot of time alone. Anyway, but it was really interesting just the way she said, well, this was normal. This is what we always did. There was always quarantining for some reason. And she said, the generations right now, they don't understand this. This is absolutely new for so many people. And I think about the fact that I was absolutely riveted as a child listening to my parents' stories about my grandparents and what they endured. And, on difficult days when it does feel like endurance, I always have something to compare it to of, how they lived and how we live now, and what those things that we complain about so easily, or that I can complain about so easily. And then when I think about where my ancestors came from, it's extraordinary that we've survived this long, and that there's a profound wisdom in the way our ancestors approached life with much less. And we're so used to having so much, and yet we're still, we're still disconnected on some ways, and still, wanting more. But really, I think what we're wanting is soul connection. And I think that's what was possible before. There was a lot more soulfulness. And there was singing around the table, and there was dancing around the table. These were things that we did. We didn't go off into separate rooms to watch shows. So I love to think about the stories of, my ancestors during the First World War. And I asked my mother, what did you do? We sat around the table and we told jokes. And I thought, that just saying it, it warms my heart to think about. We sat around the table and we told jokes as we blacked out our windows. It's like, wow. Yeah.
I'd like to just try on a few kind of disparate thoughts from that question about, the way I took it, James, was like, what is ancestry? What do the ancestors mean to you? How is that relevant to this conversation? And, Rita, you touched on your Hungarian ancestry, and you brought up war a couple of times, and several of us have mentioned Ukraine. And it's Joanna Macy's 93rd birthday today. So how is this all related? For me, as far as the first part of this conversation, is that we can't be afraid of our pain. And even before 5,000 years ago, we got slammed. It's not easy to be a human being in a physical world. And so no matter how well we were raised as children, trauma of some nature of some variety comes with the territory. So it becomes how we meet that trauma. And the first part is, really simply being able to feel our pain and be able to allow our biological reset mechanism to actually function. And so what's very interesting, and it might seem like I'm making a big leap in terms of what I'm saying now and addressing your question, is that we have this collective trauma of war, and it leaves many of us ungrieved and unceremonialized. We're kind of like dead without continuity. So one of the roles of a shaman in the shamanic tradition is psychopomp, which is to actually, in a sense, bring the dead back to life by honoring them. And my sense is the center of Europe is like it's like ground zero of trauma in some ways. It's so awful, and it's just going to keep on repeating unless we can do something about it. And so part of this conversation to me is about, that's a skill too, not necessarily to be a psychopomp, but recognizing trauma and recognizing that there's trauma in the field, whether or not we're physically in the space, and that we can energetically address trauma in a variety of ways ceremonially to, I use this word ceremonially loosely, and I don't want us to get restricted by that term, but just having the knowledge that just the word yesterday came, the undead. As long as we have a knowledge of the undead and of collective and intergenerational trauma, particularly in this case having to do with war, because it's in our face right now more than ever. That what is it? What's that phrase? Like 80% of a problem is that you don't even see it for what it is. So bringing it up into the field is important.
I'm going to jump in excitedly in some sense, although not a positive feeling excitement, more just like an inclination quickly. As much earlier in the conversation, I thought about grief and grieving. And Darsha talked about ritual healing ceremonies as being a part of the evolved nest. And there's a lot of thoughts coming in there about like ungrieved grief becomes grievance, becomes unnecessary conflict, for example, and grief being a skill sometimes more than even a feeling itself, and a skill that allows for, you know, deep pain and loss to become a kind of gratitude for what's present and what was once, and the relationship between grief and love. And there's all these things, and in that there's also Francis Weller and his comment, I think something along the lines of grief is always too much for one person to hold, and the importance of grief in community, and how much I think as a culture, or like a culture, sort of general globalized Western dominant, it's like death phobic while also death obsessed in a from a media perspective, or from an entertainment perspective, but also very grief illiterate, and so isolated. And in my experience, I'm wondering how much of my lack of sense of connection sometimes comes from, you know, a lack of grieving together. Like that's a whole area that's absolutely necessary. There's all sorts of different ways in which we connect. We connect on conversation, we connect in play, we connect in other places. But if we're not connecting in grief, you know, like there's something quintessential to our web of connecting with each other that is lost, or that isn't there.
I have
James, it has me. Sorry,
go ahead. No, Rita, you.
James, it has me thinking about this idea of holding both. That I find it fundamentally necessary as a human being, as an evolved human being, to have consciousness of both the flourishing, Darsha, that you talk about. You know, what is a sense of flourishing, but also at the same time holding the collective pain. That we have to evolve ourselves to hold both. Right now, I'm, you know, sitting in the Arctic Circle in Norway. There's an extraordinary, the sun's come out for the first time today. And I need to hold the consciousness of this while I hold the consciousness of Ukraine and Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen and Sudan. That sometimes I can think to myself, oh, I don't practice enough vitality. My focus down towards, you know, the problems of the earth, the world. But I think that we have to find a balance of having both and holding both at the same time, and sort of in an infinity symbol, that both is necessary and both is part of our humanity, because focusing too much on one, we forget the other. And so how do we come into circles where we hold that collective grief together and then watch for signs of vitality coming through? Because it's usually after we grieve deeply together that then the vitality starts to come through. And so I think it's an important practice of balance between both polarities, both consciousnesses.
Speaking of polarities, I've been thinking in the back of my mind after several comments about Ian McGilchrist's work. He has new books, 2-volume book out called The Matter with Things. And his work is all about right hemisphere versus left hemisphere. And it looks at the research where you numb one side of the brain or the other, and then you see what they're like. And his argument in his previous book, The Master and His Emissary, was that, well, he spent half of the book on the research, and then the other half was how the left hemisphere took over the Western civilization. And as a result, the left hemisphere is all about ego, linear thinking, reason. The left hemisphere thinks it's the only thing. So that's why the emissary, he starts to think he's in charge. Whereas the right hemisphere is holistic and connected and aware of dynamism. The left hemisphere likes dead things, gets into grotesque things, is very much not connected to nature, spirit, or others. So the problems we have, a lot of them seem to reside in this, underdevelopment of the right hemisphere. He doesn't talk about development at all, but he talks about how functioning goes. So I think that's an area that's ripe for more discussion.
been thinking about grief and when does grief come up? Grief comes up when there's been a loss of connection, when something that we've felt connected to is gone. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to be able to not try to do it alone. Because the task in so many ways is to be able to reconnect with your connections, to re-experience your connections. And so it really does. It's why grieving in community just feels so important. I also want to mention a small way in which, turning towards the pain. This is going to be very small kind of thing, but it comes up in a way that feels like it's able to be, fortunately, not a daily practice for me, but a frequent practice. If I stub my toe or bang into something or have some small hurt, I wasn't really conscious of this, but I used to pull my energy away from that hurt place. I've learned to turn towards it, breathe towards it, really open up the whole sensation with it. And I find that when I do that, what I'm doing is also opening up my body's healing capacity. And so it takes care of itself much more rapidly. I experience it as hurting more in the moment, in the initial moment. But that capacity to turn toward the simple pains feels like a nice ritual that makes it easier to turn toward the less common but bigger pains.
Yeah, I learned this about when I stubbed my toe. I learned to immediately I breathe into it, deep breaths. Mm-hmm. It washes over me. I'm feeling it all. It's more intense in the moment, but it lasts long. It lasts shorter. And then it's gone, and it's almost like a full body experience that helps me get through it and have it. And it's just for me, it's a better way of doing it and of experiencing pain. And of course, that can be translated into all kinds of pain, emotional pain, of course, and interpersonal pain. So I like what you're saying, Robert. I appreciate it.
I wrote a book called Wild Earth, Wild Soul, a manual for an ecstatic culture. And what you said, Charlie, reminded me that ecstasy is not bliss. And that when we're feeling that stubbed toe, or for that matter, the loss of a loved one, the ecstasy can actually be the full embrace of the pain, of the loss. And this is key. We're not trying to get rid of it. We're just saying, I'm open. Yeah. I'm completely open. I'm willing to feel this as long as it's going to be here. And so I would just suggest that ecstasy, presence, and connection are all so vitally key to this thriving that we're leading towards here, and that not turning towards the pain is that's a big deal. I mean, it's key in Buddhism. It's key to liberation.
So I'm just going to call everyone.
Actually, I was just going to say, and John and Macy's no slouch.
Go ahead, Rita.
There's a word I'd almost like to bring to the conversation about connection, which is reverence. And I think about the fact that I've sat in a lot of psychedelic circles, both learning experiences and ceremonies, and I facilitate a lot of circles and I facilitate medicine work. And I think about those connections I've made with people while in ceremony. Then years pass, and that's that very strong connection at the ceremony, and then we don't see each other, and we fall out of the sort of the emails, and then there's those times where I'm working with clients, and they say, you know, I felt such a profound sense of love today, and they come back for the integration session, and that profound sense of love is not there after the medicine, and because they felt it under the medicine, they say, today, why don't I feel this profound sense of love and connectivity that I felt yesterday? And then there's that whole integration process of how do we find that feeling again, that sense, where does that live even in a single cell in the body? But I think to myself that we have to it'd be helpful to bring the word reverence to the word connection, to have reverence for something that happened, that came and passed. That we're not going to feel it in the same way, that we may never see this person again, but can we hold a sense of reverence for something that happened in a space and time that is now past? And so that's just an offering to this word. Maybe just that for now.
So I'm going to interject the process level to bring us into the third round, but maybe just for a second, we can all just take a little breath. And we'll now enter the third round, which is that each of us will share one clear, coherent, concluding thought on the conversation we've shared today. And we'll go in the order by which I see us on the screen. So do remember who goes just before you, so you know when your turn is. And it will be Charlie, Jean, Robert, Sam, Darsha, Sky, and Rita. And I'll actually start with my closing thoughts, and then so Charlie will follow. Feeling into the conversation, there's almost this meta level of feeling more connected to each of you because we talked about connection, which I have there's a hope, because I can't really do much other than hope, that the people listening will have something akin to that, and that from this it can carry on into the next interaction that they have, that it might become maybe more than an interaction. And I guess in a sense for myself, I'm almost trying to maybe evoke the same well wishes to myself, that my next interaction will be more than an interaction, in the way that this was much more than an interaction. Because connection, clearly, and a sense of connection does matter, rather than why does it matter, just the statement of my experience is that it matters, period. Yeah. Charlie.
I only have too many thoughts. James, you got gold here as far as a recording is concerned. There's so much here. I've been taking notes from everyone, just for my own edification. There's so much wisdom here in this circle. So I'm very appreciative. For me, I just want to say that one thing I'm very aware of is personally is my own mortality and my own age here in the early 70s. And I notice that, of course, COVID made it more real to me about the importance of connection and the importance of my friends and family. And I watched my father age in a way that served as a negative role model, because he isolated himself. It was just him and his wife, and judged everyone else out of his life and became quite miserable in some certain ways at the end. There's a sense of isolation and despair, and watching that made me realize I mustn't go in that way, even though I have that tendency. So having this sense of connection with people is my lifeblood. It keeps me alive and even sometimes joyful here at this ripe old age. And so I'm very much concerned about this issue and want to be spreading the word that people can be connected and alive and joyful throughout the entire adult lifespan. So that's what I wanted to offer.
Well, at the back of my mind the whole time has been the question of what is it that James wants out of asking this question, and sort of paying attention to see if he was getting it and what was it that he was getting. And in the process, like feeling the profound amount of practice that everybody in this conversation is bringing into the conversation. And so also a phrase that I've been using in the last years, building on the feminist, the personal is political. No, the personal is structural. And it's like, so this connection is meaningful. And it's also showing us how connection is structural to the world we're trying to understand and navigate. So I'm coming back to where I started with the subjective and the objective. And for me, that integrates in the image of being anthropologists, that somehow we've ended up being anthropologists or even meta-anthropologists to what is it to be human in a world where all the cultures of the world are interconnecting and figuring out, can they relate to one another as individuals and as cultures? So that's my appreciation of sitting with this question with you all.
I guess what comes up for me is, on the one hand, a sense of the delight of discovery, of the delight of discovering all of you, some of whom I knew before, but not in this immediate form. But there's also, I would say, a sense of recognition, that the sense that we were already connected. It wasn't like we weren't connected before. We're a little more conscious of our connection now, but just the richness of fabric that we all, this is mixed metaphor, but the richness of soup that we all swim in of connection is just delightful. So thank you for the opportunity to experience that with you. And thank you, James, for setting up that opportunity.
I think an interesting thing just to kind of reflect and wrap up on is the power of connectedness, broadly speaking, even though it's very much a subjective and highly personal construct. This isn't something objective. It's not a rational, logical, fact-based domain. It's something much more to do with direct experience and emotions. And I think that's interesting because, as we can see what's going on with the environmental crisis and other things, we've got all the facts that we really should need in order to act, but they're not sufficient to motivate action at the scale and speed that needs to. But we can also see from the research on nature-connectedness that scientific knowledge of nature is a poor predictor of nature-connectedness and associated behavioral change, whereas emotions and experiential connection, that's the potential leverage to bring about change, behavioral change, and from that potentially societal change. And I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on, because it kind of, that's partly identified through the scientific domain, but it's shown that the scientific domain is not the sort of the pathway on its own to enhance connectedness. But it's also shed light on the fact that connectedness, or the pathway to it, is not a one-track road either. There are multiple pathways to connectedness in different forms, and they do tend to, or seem to, feed on each other and synergize, which I think's positive and something to be explored further.
Well, I have a bunch of notes here. I'm going to see if I can make a narrative out of all of these ideas. We live in challenging times, and we've kind of have to figure out how to find our way through these challenges. We probably can't talk about how, the climate crisis that we're in, the fossil fuel groups and business groups fought the early movement towards doing something about it in the 80s. Frontline is having a series right now on PBS about this. And how they changed the terminology from global warming to climate change. They did that on purpose because, climate change, that's normal, And so, anyway, so we have the problem of the alpha males, other alphas too, who are, just want their way and they want their money and convince everybody it's jobs. So how do we, in our ancestral context, they took care of egos. They wouldn't let the ego get big because they knew it was dangerous. They teased the big hunter until he started laughing about his animal. So setting all that aside, I think what we have to also understand is that we get easily hypnotized by the media around us. And my co-author, Four Arrows, has a PhD like in hypnosis, but he talks about the indigenous way of self-hypnotizing and using indigenous precepts and the natural world to help you self-hypnotize yourself in a proper direction, and to beware of the words and other ways people are hypnotizing you, which unfortunately, like we said earlier, right, a lot of that's going on. And we forget, it hypnotizes us into disconnection. But one of the things we have to find our way back to is our connectedness at the level of spirit. And this is Colin Turnbull, the anthropologist, talks about the Mbuti. They were very open with strangers and different ways of being. And he says he attributed it to this sense of deep connection at the level of spirit. Why worry? These people are different, that's fine. And of course, in the ancestral context, we're able to take multiple perspectives, the perspective of the beaver, of the wolf, of the wind, and other people. So that was common. It was understood that you should be doing that to be a good person, to be a good member of the bio community. And so attention, again, I always come back to attention. Where do we put our attention? It hypnotizes us. I mean, we can put ourselves in a hypnotic state because we're just focused there. But Iris Murdoch talked about whatever you put your attention to, like if you keep thinking of taking revenge about somebody, the opportunity arises. You've been rehearsing that all that time. Chances are you're going to do it, right? So It's really important to understand how much power we have. That's maybe the one power, the great power of the left hemisphere is where our attention goes. But we need to get back to the integrated brain and not be caught up in this very death-oriented left brain, scared to death of death, but then focused, completely on it. And controlling it so we don't feel anxiety, which is deeply in there for the left brain. So back to the integrated brain is about being attentive to being nature connected. We had a study published last year where we had college students just do one thing a day for 3 weeks, different things. Pay attention to the clouds today as you walk across campus. Acknowledge the trees as you walk by. Just one different thing for 3 weeks, and they built greater nature connection. We called it ecological attachment. So I think we have to just get back in the moment. Here we are, present, right? Are we connecting now, here, with whoever we are, wherever we are, the spider, the wind, the tree? And get back and practice that. And that'll help us, stimulate our vagus nerve as well, right? And all those techniques that work for us, we had to pick our own. And then I think we together can shape and shift and move our species into a better direction. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, I'm just so honored to be here. I'm a better person because of you. I realize we're 8 of us, not 7 of us. And there's a couple of words that actually didn't come up in this conversation. And I would like, I'd like to suggest that inspiration leads to connection, and that I'm really inspired by this conversation. And I think Charlie used the word gold. This is gold. And I'm just so glad. Like, there's so many really juicy, nourishing, awesome ideas that are being thrown out here. It's a beautiful thing to behold. And the other word is love. I mean, it might be overused, but Terence McKenna said to me right outside the bathroom, he said, I may speak a good game, but it's all about love. And I'll never forget it. He was, I'm a little guy, and he was towering over me. And I just was like, whoa, this is like the word of God. So, I'm feeling it. Moving into our hearts. That's another way of talking about connection. And again, very, very grateful, James, for this invitation. I've got a lot on my plate. I didn't, it was just like, oh yeah, there's the Psychedelic Café. And I read the notes, and here we are. And, this is the highlight of my day.
So I feel the sweet responsibility of tying this all up somehow, being the last one here. What I was struck by was a feeling that this sense that we are in actually a very fortunate time where we're globally disseminating and distributing so many ideas that are really advancing our ability to work in humane ways with people, to heal trauma in such humane ways. And I can hear it in everyone's language that there are things that connect us, and or ways of approach that connect us. And speaking of connection, Darsha, I just want to congratulate you on the work you're doing. It's phenomenal. Your book is here with me in Norway. It's right over there. And it's changing everything about how I work. And I want to acknowledge that polyvagal theory, attachment theory, and your expansion on attachment as well, and the indigenous ways. And I think that it's becoming woven into our lives globally. The more that I meet practitioners, the more I realize that we are speaking the same language, but in so many different ways. So I'm so encouraged by that, that we are actually with each other rather than against each other. That's really beautiful. What else do I want to say about connectivity? I'm always deeply grateful to be invited to these panels. I'm often doing my work alone in Calgary with my team. So it's beautiful to have a global connection. So thank you, James, for what you do. And I wanted to mention that psychedelics are a part of it as well. I think that there's an incredible marriage right now between the psychedelic work and the advancement in healing trauma and early development or neurobiology. So I think that we need to keep connecting all the worlds and talking with each other and finding the humane way forward.
Okay. On that note, and with this, that to the listeners, if you stick around for another couple minutes, I will list off everyone's names again and their contact links, and it'll all be contained in the show notes as well. With that said, we're going to close the Psychedelic Café here. Thank you to each of you so much for your time and your attention and your work, and bringing that all here today. It's been a real pleasure and an honor. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
James. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Good to be with you all.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah, thank you all.
And cut.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for tuning into this episode. As I said at the beginning, I really hold this one as deeply valuable personally, and I really hope that on this end, this side of the conversation, you're having experienced it similarly, and that its value will only grow as you now walk out into the world with the conversation you heard today in mind. Also, at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that you can find links to all of our respective guests and their work at jameswjesso.com in the show notes for this episode, as well as all of their episodes individually here on Adventures Through the Mind, save for Robert Gilman, which, fingers crossed, Robert, if you're listening, hopefully one day in the future, we'll have you on the show, just you and I. And finally, this show is supported by people who find value in it and voluntarily reciprocate that value through financial contribution in some variety or another. Patreon is great because it's like a monthly tip, but you could also leave a one-time donation through PayPal or cryptocurrency or buy something from the shop. Links to all of those support options are in the description to this episode wherever you're checking it out, or at jameswjesso.com/support. Again, I have been your host, James W. Jesso, and I thank you so much for tuning into Adventures to the Mind, and until the next episode, take care.